Good afternoon and welcome to our fifth installment of Business Insights. Today I am joining you from the Salopec Executive Classroom. Today's presentation is from Mr. Michael Donlan. Since graduating from JMU with a Computer Information Systems degree in 1991, Mike has spent more than 30 years in the technology industry, primarily at Oracle, Microsoft, and Apple. Prior to his retirement, Mike was responsible for Apple's education and government business, leading customers and the company through the COVID-19 global pandemic. The next time you're on campus, you may run into Mike, as he has been teaching management courses in the College of Business. Michael and his wife Jessica are alumni of JMU, and one of their 3 children is currently a junior here at JMU. Please don't forget to utilize the Q&A feature to submit your questions for Mike, who will be joining us live at the end of the presentation. And now I present to you Mr. Mike Donlan.
Thanks, Dean Biesing. It's a great honor to be here and be involved in the speaker series. It was also super great to watch the other alumni giving all their coaching and guidance and lessons learned as well in the previous sessions. I look forward to my good friend Russ Reeder, who's going to anchor us, I guess, next week. And I look forward to being here today to share some of the remarks, or share my remarks on some of the things I've learned over my career in different crisis situations, as well as the most current one. So to introduce myself, my name is Mike Donlan, obviously a JMU alumni. I'll give a little bit of my background. I've worked in the tech industry for the last 30 years, and I spent most of my time at 3 companies. Oracle, Microsoft, and Apple, always focused on the public sector, so the government and education business. And I've spent most of my time with my family here in Washington, D.C., but also lived in Singapore for 3.5 years. I ran Asia public sector, lived in the Seattle area when I worked at Microsoft headquarters on Office 365 and Azure for government education, which you probably use or some of your clients or customers use. And then for the last 3.5 years or so, before I retired in November 2020, I worked for Apple and led their government and education business. So my talk for the next 10 or 15 minutes in a kind of a TED Talk style format is going to be a compilation of lessons that I've learned and also areas where I made mistakes and learned from those mistakes. And while we all live in the challenges of this pandemic, there's been other crises in the past that there's an opportunity to both learn from and innovate things going forward to better help people or prevent some of these crises from happening. When I was in Asia, for example, it was right when SARS was hitting. There's H1N1, there's natural disasters everywhere in the world and pretty much everywhere in the United States. And then obviously the most recent financial crisis. But I've always had a passion for being closest to the customer and always liked leading and helping teams that are closest to the customer. So I'm going to try to put some context in my remarks around that, but it really comes down to 5 points. It all comes down to 5 points, and I'm going to go through those. They're not in any particular order because I think they're all equivalent and all relevant. So let's get started. So the first one is don't stand on the sidelines even when it's scary. And it doesn't matter if you're an individual contributor or you're a manager. In a crisis, you have to be able to make decisions. And you have to do that even when you might not always have all the information that you need. And that can be incredibly uncomfortable. Those decisions will not always be right, but you have to be able to act. And then course correct if you're wrong. And there'll be times when you're wrong. But this agility that's required, and I heard one of the other speakers talk about this in the previous session, this agility that's required may or may not be in your current culture. And that's something that a lot of times can make things harder. But you need to empower your team with that same philosophy. I used to tell my teams at Microsoft and Apple, for example, it's important to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And that helps kind of facilitate this mindset that you have to be able to make decisions and help your customers and clients make decisions as well. And I've kind of in my mind, I've always thought, there's 3 types of people. People that watch what happens, people that make things happen, and people that look back and say, what just happened? Don't be number 1 or number 3. You want to be number 2, people that make things happen. And I've been in a lot of situations at a lot of big companies actually where we were could be crisis, could be competitive strategy, it could be getting a product out, and we looked down and over that edge and said, whoa, that's a long way down. But you have to have the grit and fortitude to be, and that agility to figure out, because if you don't, people will call you out on it. The second one here is your experience really matters now, and the reason I say but is be careful on how you approach this. Anytime you're in a crisis, or you might be making a new product, or might be making a next generation of a current process that might have been successful, especially in a crisis or in this pandemic for sure, a lot of things that have worked in the past don't work anymore. And some of those will come back to normal. Some of them will never come back to normal. And so it's important to have kind of this mindset, or this learning mindset, versus being an expert at everything, or a know-it-all at everything. It's hard because you might have had a wealth of knowledge in a particular area, but the crisis, that it might not work exactly how things have worked in the past. But one of the things I've learned, it's super important to have this learn-it-all mentality versus the know-it-all mentality. And Satya Nadella is famous at Microsoft for stating that back when he took over CEO and wanted to change Microsoft's culture. But there's pieces underneath that's key, and you have to do it yourself. You have to do it with your leadership team. You have to do it with your culture. Listening and communicating, especially over communicating, is key. Everybody wants decisions to be made. Everybody wants to be able to hear about what's going on. They want to be able to contribute to what those decisions might be, whether it's good contribution or maybe a bad idea. It doesn't really matter, as long as people can. There's no such thing as bad ideas, I guess. You have to let people contribute. So you have to be able to confront the situation, listen, contemplate the facts, make a decision, and communicate and over communicate. You're not going to always be right, but action is better than no inaction. It'll set the stage for your culture. It'll set the stage for how innovative your business is. It'll change the mindset with your clients and customers, because a lot of times they actually don't know the answer either, especially in a crisis. And so showing them that you can figure something out, and I'll give some examples of that in a little while, is really important. But also, don't fall into the trap of what I call digital comfort food. And it's really easy right now because not many people are flying, and we have remote work culture, and a good amount of collaboration technology, if it's O365 or Zoom or Slack or whatever it might be. It's really easy to set up meetings right now. And you could argue maybe there's more meetings now than have ever been, and maybe that's a negative on innovation, because if you have a meeting or you have an all hands, it needs to be structured, and there has to be action and either input or action that comes out of it, an execution. Otherwise, you'll start to lose people, and they'll call you out on it. The other thing that is hard to figure out now in a remote environment is, how do you still cause these unintentional personal employee to employee or employee to customer interactions? It's been studied a lot, and that's where a lot of innovation comes from. And so you could be going to a meeting and sitting down to eat lunch at your corporate headquarters or your building remote office, and you see somebody and you start talking about something that's going on with another customer, or you start talking about something around a product, feedback, good or bad. That really drives innovation. And that's really hard to do right now in a remote environment, because there's no unintentional remote interactions. It's all scheduled meetings. And that's really an important thing. There's a lot of work going on to try to figure out how to do better at that. And a lot of buildings actually were built for that. I mean, Apple Park in Cupertino was designed 100% to facilitate this innovation through both managed interactions, which could be one-on-ones and meetings and all hands, but also this unintentional personal interactions. I think the new College of Business is going to be really good for that, hopefully when kids are back in the fall. And I think that's a real opportunity. But, to close this bullet out, if you say it and you don't lead it by example, people are going to call you out. And they might not do it directly to you, but it'll be in the culture. And it's kind of like saying you're on a diet, but if you go out to eat, you get a Diet Coke and also a Big Mac. You're not really on a diet if you're doing that. So lead by example. So let's go to the next one. So number 3 is control the uncontrollable. And this is a tough one because there's times, especially during a crisis, during a pandemic, but in other times, it feels like there's nothing you can control on a situation with a customer or on the business side. And the philosophy I always learn is there always is something. And I kind of have this vision of, you know how you've seen the free climbers, they're climbing up and they might pull themselves up and they have, you know, their finger on a little piece of rock and then they end up climbing. That's the way I look at it. And what you'll find is once you find that first little rock, then all of a sudden it becomes clear there's all these other rocks. And sometimes it's very difficult. I'll give you a real world example. So last March, I can't really go into some of the customers' names, but you know, there were several very, very large orders coming out of K through 12 in the United States for devices. And because schools obviously were closing. And not only was the amount unprecedented, so you have a supply chain issue and try to figure out how to get these amount of devices to a customer, the whole model was different because you know, traditionally schools, if you're probably not familiar with K through 12, but you can understand this example. Most schools historically have used Wi-Fi. Now they want it all LTE. And the reason is not everybody has Wi-Fi at home. And so they wanted LTE. Then they had the problem of how do you distribute devices when kids are not in school? Do you set up giant drive-through kind of delivery systems? Do you use buses that are doing free and reduced lunch to do a reverse supply chain? How do you get them set up? How do you manage them? You know, how do you do security on them? And so all this had to be figured out in a period of really 2 months. And so that's definitely a situation where you can look over that edge I was talking about, like this is uncontrollable. It's really not. And you know, I would also say sometimes it's good to break down a crisis into different parts to learn, because there's going to be a part of a crisis where it's just so crazy, you're just triaging stuff. And I would say, you know, February through April of last year was like that. It's really, you can't unscramble that egg. But what is really interesting is what's been learned going forward, that even when, for example, kids are back full-time in school, there's a lot of new things that have been learned on technology. And so I think, and same is true with other industries. So, you know, that's a really important one on controlling the uncontrollable. Let's go to number 4. Now, number 4 is what I didn't come up with. My grandfather used to tell me this. If it was easy, everybody would be able to do it. My grandfather was one of the founders of NASA and led manned space flight from Mercury through the space shuttle program. But this one is hard. Because if it was easy, everybody would be able to do it. And the reality is everybody can't. I had a really interesting, because it's hard work, I had a really interesting session with a person at the time. He still is, he's the sports psychologist for the Seattle Seahawks. And now he has this big other business, big famous podcast, and does this consulting to companies on mindset and everything else. His name's Mike Gervais. And he was telling me the story on how they would test the ability to succeed in endurance in football players. And one of them was grit, which I love this because I think grit is one of the most important characteristics to be successful. You'd have to be able just to hang in there and grind it out through very hard times a lot of time. But he was saying, and I was blown away by this, he was saying that they would do tests where they would time people on how long they could keep their eyes open without blinking. And it got real competitive with all the football players. And he does this in his teaching class that he does to companies and organizations, but try it. It's incredibly hard. But I thought that was a fascinating story. The other thing I would say on this one is get your own board of directors that can personally help you. You know, it's impossible for a single person to know everything, but everybody knows something. And so if you have a good board of directors, quote unquote, that can help guide you, give you advice, bounce things off of, both for you personally in your career, but also, you know, honestly in your a different group in your own business, a different group within customers, that's really important. So finally, let's go to the last one, number 5. So this last one around faith, family, firm, it kind of puts it in perspective for me. And when I use the word faith, I don't really mean religion. Obviously, it could mean religion to people, but it's more about having this balance. And I think it's really hard right now. You always hear work-life balance is hard, but now in a remote environment, those lines between work and life are really blurred. And it's hard to kind of get out of this, 24/7 thing that it feels like sometimes. So it's more of the principle. And I think it's really important just to find that balance. And I'll tell you one of the core tenets that I've always tried to do, and it's the reason, even though I'm in the technology industry, I've always kind of stayed in education and government, because I think one of the most important things anybody can do is be a positive influence into the life of a child. Now, my kids will tell you I'm not perfect at that with my 3 boys, but everything that I do today, I'm teaching obviously as adjunct faculty with Dr. David Peterson. Part of the reason I want to go back and teach is I'm so passionate about helping and facilitating learning in students and children. So I will wrap it up here. Thanks again for the time out of your day, and I hope some of that reflection will be beneficial. Feel free to ping me on LinkedIn if you want, and I'll turn it back to Dr. Biesing.
Thank you so much, Mike. We have some questions starting to roll in. And if you have not entered your question yet, I encourage you to use the question and answer feature, the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And one of the things you mentioned that I found very interesting was about the global pandemic creating some new learnings on technology. And so I was thinking about your background with both Apple and Microsoft, and what types of opportunities, if you could share some of your insight based on your experience, what kind of opportunities do you think those 2 companies might seize?
Are you asking based on the technology those companies make into other organizations, or are you asking what how Microsoft and Apple might change?
Yeah, how they, like, maybe with innovation and new product development and things that they've seen that we've as consumers of technology embraced.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think on the Microsoft side, Microsoft's always been in the productivity and collaboration business, way back in the early versions of Windows and Microsoft Office. And, most recently on the cloud platform around collaboration with Microsoft Teams and, everything that goes around that. And I think, the pandemic, a lot of times it drives clarity on what's really important to have as a feature in remote meetings. So, example, one of the things Microsoft just rolled out, actually, it's always it can be kind of sterile to have these Zoom meetings or these other meetings where everybody's on a picture-in-picture type of thing. And they've rolled something out that it actually looks like you're sitting next to somebody, which I thought was kind of innovative. And so it's how do you break down this paradigm? The other thing that I think is really hard that everybody's trying to figure out is this unintentional interaction between people, in between studying, in between classes, in between meetings. That's where a lot of learning and innovation comes from. And I mentioned, I think the College of Business is going to be fantastic for that as things open up. But also, I think the online collaboration tools have to get a little bit better at that as well. And so that's from the Microsoft side. On the Apple side, I think, sometimes in a crisis, it actually, you learn new things, but it actually reinforces and pulls innovation that might be in the pipeline forward. And so, I mentioned the example I gave on, several large school districts had to order, hundreds and hundreds or millions of devices, basically, not even hundreds of thousands, across the US. And there was a problem in rural areas or underserved areas where, people didn't have Wi-Fi at home or Wi-Fi wasn't available at home. And that kind of coincided with, the technology trend that's going to happen with LTE and, the next gen there, the new version of LTE that's being rolled out and will continue to be rolled out, it's 300 megabits a second, which is, could be as fast as Verizon Fios to your house. And so that's accelerated a lot of that next gen LTE and Wi-Fi plans for, not just Apple, but the telcos and others as well. So that's, those are 2 examples. I think on the non-tech side, there was a lot of adoption, even when I was at, Microsoft, from government and education customers, adopting cloud, just like JMU has. And, that was pretty well established, but there was also a lot of companies in that culture that still weren't doing it. The remote meetings and kind of that in the culture of not having to be in person for everything or not having to be in a building for everything. And I think that's really going to be something that goes forward as a new paradigm with a lot of companies, and not having to be at a corporate headquarters or a remote office all the time. And I actually think it's great for innovation because you can hire the best and the brightest, and they don't have to necessarily live in Silicon Valley or live in New York City or Washington, D.C. So I think that's going to be fantastic as well.
Thank you. I think that's so interesting, and it goes very nicely with, you talked about the digital comfort food, and maybe if we're not all working remotely, that'll kind of help keep that into check. As far as, hey, we get it that you're remote, don't be scheduling meetings with no purpose and outcomes and that sort of thing, because we're all back at the office.
I think that's a great point. I was talking to one of my former colleagues who was a vice president at Microsoft about this, and he said, we didn't have time to do all these meetings before because, you were on an airplane or you're visiting customers, and, it's really easy to schedule meetings. But they have to have a purpose. They have to have an outcome. They have to have input. Otherwise, it's kind of like chewing gum for the mind. There's no nutritional value, right?
That's right. Thank you. And then you talked about action is better than no action. And that kind of leads to, and I think about, my world is higher education. And I often see, not just with JMU, but with any university, there's this sort of idea of, we don't want to be first out of the chute on this, and so we're gonna kind of wait and see what our peer schools do. Certainly, in the state of Virginia, and I talk with a lot of business school deans, it's the feeling for all of them where you don't want to. There's a reluctance to make a bad decision, so sometimes we don't make a decision, and that's true in higher education. But I love that statement. Action is better than no action. Meaning that everybody's operating with uncertainty, including your customers. So you make the best use of the information you have, and you make a decision and you go forward, and hopefully, it was a good calculated risk. With that, if you compare and contrast Microsoft with Apple, since you have experience in both places, how do you compare the culture, and is one company more risk averse than the other, and maybe provide an example or two?
Oh no, I saw that in the chat question as well. That's a great question. I think the interesting thing about being first of all, the industry that I worked in, the tech industry, you have to be have a appetite to take risk. Otherwise, you won't be successful, because it's the only industry in the world that reinvents itself every 7 years, basically. And so I think, Microsoft and Apple are pretty good at taking risks. On the Microsoft side, they basically bet the whole company on cloud. Windows at one point in time was 90% of their profit, and now it's less than 10%. And cloud is a much bigger portion, both on the collaboration side and how they compete, with Amazon and others. But the thing I would emphasize, I've never really seen somebody get it right perfectly the first time. And I think that's kind of one of the lessons I've learned, is that you can't fail, but you should make mistakes. If you don't make mistakes, I don't think you're trying hard enough. It's kind of like you're not going to get better skiing, or whatever the analogy is, if you're not falling, if you're not trying hard enough. And sometimes in a fast moving industry, it can mean the death of you as a company if you're not innovating always. But you have to be able to try things, and if you don't get it right in version 1, you might get it half right. In version 2 and version 3 are going to be a lot better, and there's things you learn along the way. And Apple is the same way. I mean, you can listen to any of the Wall Street analysts, or any of the Gartner, or any of the industry analysts talk about Apple, and Apple is obviously a very successful company, but they in many ways are kind of like Microsoft, where they had so much of their revenue coming off the iPhone, just like Microsoft did on Windows. And if you've watched Apple's earnings over the last few quarters, they've done a really good job on diversifying their revenue mix through innovation on things like AirPods or the Apple Watch or the services that they're doing. In fact, Apple's doing an announcement here at 1 o'clock on some new things, which will be interesting to see. But I think they're both pretty good at innovating and taking risks. The cultures are different, but in a lot of ways, one of the things I talked about actually in Dr. Peterson's class yesterday was this importance of being able to indirectly influence. And as a leader, it's really easy to tell people what to do if they report to you. It's really hard to indirectly influence other groups to change their business direction of, whatever that group is that you need them to do something to support you and your customers. You have to be able to indirectly influence both groups and people, and that's a really hard skill. But that skill is really prevalent in both Apple and Microsoft's cultures.
Great, thank you. And here's a question in the chat. What do you think was your greatest leadership moment where you applied your 5 principles?
Oh gosh, definitely this past year in the pandemic. It's the hardest I've worked and probably the most challenging thing I've had to lead through and figure out in the 30 years that I've been doing it. Back in March, I'll never forget this. I had to have an emergency flight home. My son got hurt playing lacrosse, and I had to fly back from Cupertino. And I was spending, before the pandemic, I was probably out in Cupertino 2 weeks a month, and I had to fly back. And then literally that next week is when all the lockdown stuff started. And I probably worked, 8 weekends straight, 24/7, trying to figure things out. And that was probably the hardest. And we definitely made some mistakes. And so did customers, because customers were panicked as well. I mean, you remember this in the higher ed side and on the government side with Department of Defense. How do you get the mercy and the comfort, for example, was being put in a position to help out New York City and others. And they had to have, how do you have this mobility to do all the medical charts, et cetera, et cetera. The kids obviously had to do remote learning and do it in a secure way with high bandwidth on both the higher ed and K through 12 side. But that's definitely the hardest crisis I've been through.
So here's kind of a follow-up question that I would have then. So, and this will sound odd in the front end, but you've had the luxury of leading through 2 global pandemics. So go back to Asia for a moment during SARS. What are the key takeaways from, as you look back on that, the things that served you well during, that you learned maybe through that experience that served you well during the most recent COVID-19 global pandemic?
I think, over and above the 5 things that I talked about, it's really easy. You have to pace yourself. It's really easy. It's super high stress inside the company that you're working for. It's, dealing with the crisis. It's super high stress trying to take care of your teams. It's high stress to, help with, family members or, kids and that type of thing during this. And then, customers are getting really stressed as well because they're on the opposite side, but still have a lot of the same problems, actually, family, friends, et cetera, else they might have to take care of. And you have to just keep kind of this even keel. That's where I kind of came up with the control the uncontrollable thing. But, keep an even keel. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's literally those 5 things. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on, what are if I could, put it in a nutshell, what were the 5 things that I really learned the most about over my career, shaped a lot by crises. You learn a lot in the crisis. I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and one of the things that my grandfather used to say, and when it's low tide, you see where the mud is. And so sometimes when everything's good and it's high tide, you actually don't see where you can really improve. And it's always a clarifying moment when you're faced with a really hard time to act and innovate and fix things that might not have been perfect in the past that you really didn't realize. And that could be, it could be the financial crisis, it could be SARS, it could be the COVID pandemic, it could be a natural disaster. Well, I've been involved in helping, I'm sure a lot of folks on the call have too, on a lot of disasters, both in Asia, but, the hurricanes and tornadoes and the things that have happened in the US where they just need help and you have to kind of work with them to figure it out and react quickly, even if it's not perfect.
And that kind of leads into this next question. I think you can also see in the chat. It says, how have you influenced state governments to partner with corporations with expertise that can help during a crisis mode? So the example is Virginia State Employment Commission. This individual read where unemployed persons as recent as April 1st can't make sense of the system and they can't get in touch with anyone. So what influence do large corporations have to help with things like call centers and so forth?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I would give you another example where Here in Fairfax County where we live, there was a lot of problems with remote learning right when the pandemic happened. And I think one of the things that's important that sometimes is a wake-up call, you have to be innovating and transforming and trying to make sure you drive excellence in what you do before there's a crisis or before there's a pandemic. And there's many examples where people hadn't updated software, and a crisis hits and there's more volume or demand on a system that's ever been heard of, and things are crashing left and right. There's a lot of cases where everything went pretty well, actually, when they were modern, they were up to date on their technology systems. So the Virginia employment one's interesting. I mean, think about just the math numbers on how many people were unemployed normally in a normal non-crisis type of environment, and how fast that went up. And so, I've read a couple of the same articles, and I think that, there's a lot of things outdated. Call systems were outdated. The technology, to do stuff online is super outdated. People couldn't get in touch with anybody. And fast forward a year, I think the state of Virginia has just finished the first wave of a good upgrade to some more modern technology. I think the article I read, they hadn't updated their online and call center environment in like 10 years because there was never really the demand or need to. But sometimes they can come back to bite you.
So always be thinking about that next crisis, it sounds like, and making sure your systems, while they might be suitable for current call volume and so forth, be thinking about that next surge. Always.
Yeah, and then I would say, always be thinking about how to innovate and transform, not just for a crisis, but also if you're competing in the commercial world, against your competitors, you want to always have that product timeline and be innovating and not get leapfrogged by a competitor. And on the public sector side, your constituents are going to be students in the case of education and citizens in the case of government. They're always going to demand, they're going to always have a higher bar of expectations that the public sector has to serve. And, so that's that innovation, and it kind of really boils over in a crisis if you haven't been keeping up with it and innovating.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to you today. You are one of those examples of when we can get you back into our classroom, the wealth of experience that you bring is so impactful. And so I'd like to thank you on behalf of the entire College of Business, and thank you for today. And
my pleasure. It's been super fun. I've actually learned a lot teaching. I had never taught before. So it's been super fun, and, happy to do the session today, and look forward to continue to, teach with Dr. Peterson going forward. And I really appreciate it. Go Dukes.
Thank you. And I would like to remind everyone, April 27th, so next Tuesday, we'll have our 6th installment where we will be welcoming Russ Reeder to speak with us and have some FaceTime with him. I would point out the two QR codes here. So one is for registering on your left for the next event. And then if you like what you saw today and want to invest in future events like this for the College of Business to help make this possible, please click on the right for your opportunity to make that investment. So thank you so much. And until next time, we'll look forward to seeing you.